Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be in Jeremiah 29 tonight. Jeremiah 29. So we're going over passages that are commonly misused. And I kind of tried to formulate these to where the first is kind of the most misused, at least in my opinion, of course. It's all in my opinion. So tonight we're going to go over Jeremiah 29, verse 11. What number of this is what? No, I started at the most misused as far as I see it. But then again, that's all subjective. You know what I mean? It's all subjective. So, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. Somebody read that for me, please.
For I know the plans I have for you. This is the Lord's declaration. Plans for your welfare, not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope.
All right, so usually it's really popular that this verse is used in reference to what is called the prosperity gospel, or just the idea that God's plans for everyone is always good and positive and so forth. Like John and I were talking today, that a lot of people today have this misunderstanding that God only wants a good life for us here, and that good life is defined as blank. What are some things that people misunderstand that they think God wants them to have in this life? Can you think of some things? Nice big house, lots of money, fancy cars, mostly material things. But then also, some people will think, like what John and I were talking about today, that there's a lot of people that think, well, God's plan for me is for me to be happy in this life. And I'm never supposed to be sad. I'm never supposed to have any kind of adversity when it comes to emotional needs or anything like that. God's plan for me is for welfare and for a future and hope. That's Jeremiah 29:11. In fact, what I tried to do was find some clips online. I don't know why it's popping again. It's this thing. I tried to find some clips online of sermons or preachers using Jeremiah 29:11 for use in the prosperity gospel. The idea that if you give money to the church or if you sow your seed financially, then God will give it back fourfold or tenfold or however many fold that they, whatever Bible verse they're using for that. And there were so many, I couldn't pick which ones, so I just said, never mind. Because I just found lists and lists and lists of them. So Jeremiah 29, verse 11. I have plans for you. Those plans are for welfare, for future, and for hope, and not for evil. All right? Now, let's go into the context of this verse, okay? If you're going to study a Bible passage, the first thing you need to do is find the context. What are some things that we need to look for in order to find the context of a Bible verse? Therefore and wherefore, which means basically you need to look at whatever came before that, right? What are some other things we need to look to find the context of a Bible verse, What can you think of? Translation, yeah. You need to make sure that you're using an actual translation, not a paraphrase, right? Paraphrases are good in some situations, but not to try to make doctrine off of, right? What are some other things? So the verses directly before it or directly after it, the who said it, to whom was it said, what situation was it said in, right? Can anybody think of any others? Which testament is it in, right? Jeremiah is in which testament? Old Testament. So right off the bat, we know it's probably a prophet that's writing. It's probably written to Jewish people. And so some of that might have some bearing on that. Now, at the same time, the book of Psalms or the book of Proverbs or the book of so-and-so is also Old Testament. It's also written to Jews, and it's also written to people under the old law. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing we can learn from it, right? It's just we need to understand what is the setting of this verse so that then we can see, is it actually talking to me? Fun fact, how many Bible verses are literally speaking to us today in 2024? This is not a fact, it's a question. How many Bible verses, there are 31,102 of them, how many of those are literally speaking to you and me today? The number I just said, 31,102, the number in the New Testament? All right. It's a trick question. 0 of them. How many Bible verses were written to you? None. The entire Bible was finished 2,000 years ago almost. 1,900 years ago. So it wasn't written to us, but everything in the Bible is used for us, right? Romans 15:14 says the things that were written in the Old Testament are written for our learning. There are principles that we need to follow. There's the understanding of the new covenant that we follow, the New Testament, right? But even then, the whole Bible is applicable to us in one way or another. But none of it was written to me, and none of it was written about me. It's all written to other people about other things, but we look to it for our learning because it is inspired and it teaches us how to live for God. Okay? So let's look at the context of Jeremiah 29:11. I have plans for you. Plans are not evil. They are for a future and for a hope. So, Jeremiah chapter 29. Somebody get verse 1 for me. Jeremiah 29, read verse 1 for me. This is the immediate context of verse 11 that we're studying tonight.
This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and the priests. The prophet sent all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon.
All right, so what is the actual, to whom is this chapter written? Who is it actually written to? To the captives. Where are they? They're exiled in Babylon, right? And what group of those, it wasn't just all the exiles, but it was to who? Yeah, so it was primarily to elders, priests, and prophets, and then all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile. So it's not to all Jews. It's to the people who had been taken from Jerusalem to exile in Babylon. That's who the book is written, or this chapter is written to. All right, if you look down at chapter 29, verse 4 through 10, they're instructed to build permanent homes in Babylon. Okay, so this is right before our verse, right? I want you to build permanent homes in Babylon. Why would God have instructed the Jewish exiles in Babylon who had been taken from Jerusalem? Why would he have instructed them to build permanent homes there? Does anybody remember how long they were in Babylonian captivity? Anybody remember? 70 years. So why do you think God would have told them, if you're going to spend 70 years there, why do you think God would have told them to build permanent homes? You're going to be there for a while, right? Yeah, you're going to be there for a minute. So build your homes, get comfortable. You're going to spend 70 years in Babylon. This is not something that's going to happen overnight.
But just the fact that you say captivity, you would think that they wouldn't have that option to build a home to be comfortable if you're in captivity.
Yeah, so the phrase captivity is, it's kind of misconstrued in some ways in today's world. Basically, what would happen is Nebuchadnezzar, or the conquering country, would go into a nation. They would take the smartest, the leaders, the young people, and they would take them back to Babylon, where they weren't necessarily slaves all the time. Some of them were meant to be slaves in some ways, but the majority of the people that they would take back are the people that are the most impressionable, so the youngest people. They would take the leaders and they would take them back and they would basically instruct them on the ways of the new country. Yeah, they would get the people to assimilate into this new culture, right?
So basically, you can interpret it as captivity is being confined.
Yeah, they were confined.
Captivity sounds like, oh, you got my hands tied behind my back.
Yeah. Prison.
Yeah. So we're captive in this prison.
You were not allowed to leave, right? They were not allowed to leave Babylon, but they weren't like in prison. So if you look at like Daniel's in Babylonian captivity, and he's allowed to basically live his life outside of certain things, right? So Nebuchadnezzar, same king of Babylon, goes to Daniel and he says, I want you to eat certain foods. Daniel and his friends say, we're not going to eat those foods. Why would Nebuchadnezzar want them to eat certain foods? Because that's the food the Babylonians eat, right? So they're trying to get them to assimilate into the culture. And eventually, a lot of times they would send some of those people back to the captive land so that then they could assimilate. But that would take a few generations so that they would get everybody used to it. The people that were left were, in Hebrew, they were called the Anaim, or the left people. So if you look at like Matthew 5, 6, and 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, the people, the blessed and the poor in spirit, that's the word Anaim, the people that were left behind. And he's basically bringing this idea together of the people that were outcast, the people that aren't necessarily seen as the most productive parts of society, are the people that are going to be those poor in spirit. They're going to be rich in eternity kind of thing. So they weren't like in prison. They were more... They were more taken back to basically brainwash them, if that makes sense, into being this new culture. So Jeremiah says, you're going to be there for 70 years. Build permanent houses. Chapter 29, verse 8. Let's skip that. We'll read that here in just a little bit. Chapter 29, verse 10. They were to wait 70 years, and then God would start bringing his people back to Jerusalem. So instead of, this is verse 10 through 14, instead of Babylon eventually sending some of the people back to cause the people that had been left over to assimilate more into the Babylonian culture, God is going to start sending them back. That's when he says, verse 11, I have plans for you. They're not evil, they're to prosper. I have a future and a hope for you. Because eventually, God is going to send the people back from Babylonian captivity. Now, why are they in Babylon in the first place? What caused them to go to Babylon? Other than Nebuchadnezzar took over the nation of Israel. Do what? Well, they wanted a king. Mainly because they had started practicing idolatry. They had left the covenant that they had made with God. And so God is punishing them by sending them into Babylon, allowing Babylon to take over them. Then you drop down to verse 15 through verse 23. In the meantime, while the Jews are in Babylon, they're going to have punishment. They're being punished for their decisions in Babylon. That's why God allowed them to go into captivity in the first place. Because they had been following these false prophets. And those false prophets are really important for this context. So it's almost as if God is saying, listen, I understand that your situation in Babylon is horrible. I understand that it is a long time until you go home, 70 years, basically 2 generations, depending on how you count it, basically the majority of 2 generations. But you need to get comfortable there. You need to live there. You need to make your lives there, because eventually you're going to come home, but it's not going to be anytime soon, right? And so in that context, then God tells Jeremiah to tell the people, I have plans for you to prosper. Because right now in Babylon, you're not prospering. You're essentially there so that you can learn their culture, and you're being forced into labor. Sometimes it was hard labor. A lot of times it wasn't necessarily that hard of labor. But you're being forced into labor, and you're servants of the king for this amount of time. Okay, so that's the culture. Now, what is the danger of using this verse, Jeremiah 29:11? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. What is the danger of using that verse in today's world?
Because we create our own definition.
Yeah, exactly. We've created our own definition, also not written to us. In fact, there's an argument to be made that Jeremiah 29:11 isn't even applicable to us in most ways, right? Now, are there things we can learn from it? Yeah. We can learn all about the captivity in Babylon. We can learn all about the mindset of the Jewish people in this time. But it is dangerous for us, or for anyone, to use that verse and say, here's what God's plan is for you. God's plan is for you to prosper. I saw a clip today of a preacher, and really I didn't want to put the clips in because they made me more mad than anything, and I didn't want to get mad while I was teaching. But one of the clips was God paid for your way out of sin, and He paid for your way out of poverty, because God's plan for you is to prosper. And so if you're a Christian, then you are going to prosper. You're going to have nice things. You're going to have nice... Now, is it true that Christians, people who are living out their faith, oftentimes are more productive, are more blank? You know, like I was talking with Kurt a few weeks ago about my obsession with LDS doctrines and so forth. Why is it that people who follow the LDS false gospel, it is 1,000% false. There's nothing in those books that is accurate whatsoever. Why is it that people who follow that seem to be pretty well-to-do, pretty affluent people? Why is it? Because you're focusing more on your life. It has nothing to do with necessarily the doctrine, because there are faithful Christians who are faithful to the New Testament, who are faithful to the gospel, who don't have fancy things, right? But sometimes people are focusing on their life, they're self-reflective, and so they're saying, what can I do better? How do I need to work better? How do I need to pay attention more, or work with my wife more, or how can I serve more at my job, or so forth? And so sometimes people who are Christians have nice things, but not all the time, right? Sometimes people who are Christians, who are faithful, who are self-reflective and paying attention to all those things and working hard on their life, also catch a sickness that completely destroys them financially. Also have something happen where their company downsizes and now they're completely lost. You know what I mean? So the danger of using Jeremiah 29:11 and applying it for us today is that it assumes that if God loves you, then you're going to prosper. And that's just simply not the case. God loves all of us. And prospering, while it has something to do with our faith, does not have everything to do with our faith. Just from a personal perspective, this topic is really, really aggravating to me because, y'all know, I grew up, we were like poor. Lived in our car for a few years, lived with grandparents because we couldn't afford it. We used to joke, Mom used to make a joke that it was a joke, but it also wasn't a joke, that anytime the apartment got dirty, we would move. And it was mainly because it takes about the amount of time for an apartment to get dirty as it does for a landlord to get tired of you not paying your rent. So we would move all the time, you know. Like I was thinking about it the other day. Becca was like, my mom's house is the one that I grew up in. And I was thinking, I can name like 30 houses that I grew up in. You know? So the reason why it's so particular to me is I blatantly remember growing up going to pay admission to go hear men like Benny Hinn preach. If you don't know who Benny Hinn is, he's about as worthless as a left-handed football bat. I can't stand him. But the reason is because he would say, you give your money, you sow your seed, and God will give it back tenfold. Mom, please don't give our rent money to Benny Hinn. And she would, because she had faith. She believed. She wanted God to help her. And so this guy on the stage was saying something. So, you know, some people will give, they will tithe their way into poverty because Jeremiah 29:11 is misused, right?
Tom, you still have people in the Church of Christ that when the offerings come around, they think the more they give, they're going to get blessed with that much more.
Yeah. Now, if we give, is God going to bless us? Yes. But it's not a transaction. Yeah, it's not a, well, if I give $1, God will give me 10. This is not the stock market. This is, right. So, yes, there are principles about this that are consistent, but at the same time, using this verse, and here's a fun fact. Somebody read Jeremiah 29, verse 8 and 9 for me. It's on the screen if you want to read it. We got fancy screens now. I can use them on Wednesdays. A fancy screen. Go ahead.
Do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them with their stories.
All right, wait a second. That verse, verses 8 and 9, comes right before God says, I have plans to prosper you. What do you think the diviners and the prophets in Babylon were trying to tell them? The Babylonian prophets and diviners were trying to tell them what? Yeah, either follow King Nebuchadnezzar, or the false prophets of the Jewish people are trying to tell them, hey, this isn't going to be that long. Don't worry. Don't build houses. You don't need to build. We're only here for a few years. Just live in your tents. And then God says, nope, go ahead and build your houses. You're going to be here for a while. Don't worry about all this. God's going to get us back to Jerusalem real quick. Don't listen to your prophets and your diviners who are among you. They deceive you. It's a lie that they're prophesying to you in my name. So literally right before Jeremiah 29:11, where he says, I have plans for you to prosper that are not evil, for a future and hope. He literally says, when people are telling you that everything's going to be rainbows and sunshine, it's a lie. Right? So the context of the verse also says that the idea of prosperity, that God only wants his people to be prosperous, is a lie. Now, how then does God want us to understand this? All right? Look at, somebody read, I'll read Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 through 4. It's a longer one, so I'll read it. Everybody open up there if you'd like to. Colossians 3, 1 through 4. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, which are where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. So where do we need to be focusing? Our physical things and the prosperity of our physical lives, or spiritual things and the prosperity of our spiritual life? Where do we need to be focusing? The spiritual, right? Taking Jeremiah 29:11 and applying it to physical is a problem, because what is the last word of Jeremiah 29:11? I'm going to give you a future, and I'm going to give you a hope. Hope is not physical, right? Hope is spiritual. He's saying this is not the end. I'm bringing a Messiah. That Messiah is going to save you from your sins. He's going to right all the wrongs of the past, and it's going to set us up on a future, right? So, So let's look at how can we use Jeremiah 29:11 today, okay? How should we use it? If it's not talking about God is going to prosper us physically and we're going to have all the nice things that we want, then how can we use this verse, okay? Because we don't want to just talk about how, prosperity gospel preachers are charlatans. We also want to talk about how do we use the Bible, okay? How can we apply this verse? So let's go to some other verses. Somebody get Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6. Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6 for me, please.
Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king, and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, and this is the name by which he shall be called, the Lord is our righteousness.
All right, why did God send them into this punishment in Babylon? So they could realize that regardless of how bad you get, God still wants you to follow him. Still loves you, still wants you to follow him. He's going to send you into Babylon for 70 years. It's going to be a long time, but it's not forever. And he has plans for you. And those plans are to send this Messiah. So no matter how unfaithful they were, God is trying to remind them through the entire book of Jeremiah that he is going to be faithful to his promises. They had made a covenant with God to live faithfully to him. They had not kept their promise. But God is going to keep his, and eventually he's going to send the Messiah. All right, Romans 3, verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? No, right? So what Romans 3:3 is talking about is exactly what is going on in Jeremiah. The people were unfaithful. Does that mean God's not going to keep his end of the bargain? No, he's going to keep it. He's going to do what he said he was going to do, regardless of if people say do what they say they're going to do or not. And then 1 Peter 1, verse 20, this was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for your sake. So God knew this was going to happen to begin with. God knew that Adam and Eve were going to sin. God knew that the people of Israel were going to create idols or start following idols. God knew all of this was going to happen. He allowed them to do what was wrong so that he could punish them, so he could show them that he still loves them. Now, is punishment fun? No. I don't know about y'all. It might have been a long time since y'all got punished by your parents, but it's never fun, right? Even if your parents are super lax and never get on to you, the one time they do, it's going to stick, right? So punishment is never fun, but God knew before the foundation of the world what he was going to do, and he put them into this situation in Babylon because of their sins, because he was going to show that he's going to remain faithful above everything that they are going to do. He will continue to live, continue to fulfill his promises. He's going to send a Messiah. If all that's true, how do we take Jeremiah 29:11, pluck it out of its context and say, hey, this verse says that God only wants me to be happy. Well, if God only wants me to be happy, then why did, before the foundation of the world, he knew that he was going to send his people into Babylon to be captives for 70 years? If he only wants us to be happy, why did he do that? Because the purpose of punishment is to remind us that God is faithful, right? That God will keep his promises. All right, so let's move on from this one. So point number 2. So now, how do we see what God's plan is for us? Somebody get Romans chapter 9, 22 through 24 for me, please. Romans 9, 22 through 24.
What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory, the vessels of mercy, which he has
All right, so God showed his wrath in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand. So God's plan was to restore Jerusalem, to restore the Jewish people, so that he could send the Messiah, right? Remember, the whole storyline of the Old Testament is that way because God is keeping the bloodline pure and away from idolatry. Not pure in a genetic sense, pure in a spiritual sense. God is keeping the bloodline of Jesus pointed, at very least, pointed towards him. Now, sometimes they're pointed, a little cockeyed, and he's got to bring him back. But at least in the right direction towards him, so that eventually he could send the Messiah, right? So if we're looking at Jeremiah 29 and we want to say, what does this have to do with me? Why is this? I know it's not talking about prosperity gospel. I know it's not talking about that God only wants us to be happy. There's one very famous megachurch pastor whose wife got to preach one Sunday. There's a lot of things. Listen. Anyways. His wife got to preach one Sunday, and he literally just says, or she says, God only wants you to be happy. God doesn't care if you're happy or not. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. God wants you to be faithful. Sometimes you being faithful means you aren't happy. Read Romans 9. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? He's allowed these people to be unhappy in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory. Sometimes God allows us to be unhappy so that we will look at him and say, oh, that's God, right? Sometimes God allows us to not be prospering, so we'll look at him. The people of Jerusalem are not prospering in Jeremiah 29. They're in captivity. They're having to eat weird foods, speak a new language, learn a new language, learn a whole new system of math and science and everything else, because the Babylonians had completely different knowledge of anybody else, which is, theirs was a little more progressed past what the Jewish people did. But they're having to learn all these new things. They're not prospering. They're barely making by. But because of that, God is reminding them, hey, I'm going to save you. Now, let's talk about what John mentioned a little bit ago. Not only, let's read Jeremiah 29:11 again. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans of welfare and not evil, to give you a future and a hope. I think the main problem with the idea that maybe Jeremiah 29:11 is talking about physical prosperity is because of that word welfare. What do y'all think of when you think of the word welfare? What comes to mind? Other than welfare programs. Okay. But at the same time, kind of what welfare programs are meant to do. Yeah, your health, your physical needs, right? Welfare programs are meant to help those who need physical help. So whether it's financial help or health-wise help or some other kind of physical need, our welfare systems in America are meant to do that. A lot of times they don't do that for various different reasons, but they're meant to do that at least, right? So in our language, we think of welfare as being primarily physical because we live in a country, in this Western country, where we have separation of church and state. And so welfare systems they don't care about where you go to church. They can't care about where you go to church. They just help everybody that they can. And then there's red tape and everything else, right? So this is the actual word for welfare, shalom. It's a Hebrew word. It is very, very popular of Hebrew, in the Hebrew passages. If you use your concordance, you look up how many times. Hundreds of times shalom is used. It literally means peace, right? It means peace. It doesn't mean have a lot of nice things in your house, or have a big house, or have money. In fact, it has very little to do with any of those things. It means peace. So let's look at these verses real quick. Somebody get James chapter 4, verse 4, please. James chapter 4, verse 4. It does not have the word shalom in it. It has the opposite of shalom, but we'll see why here in just a second. James 4, verse 4.
You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?
That one's a hard one.
Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God.
All right, enmity. That's the opposite idea of, it literally means enemy, but it's the opposite idea of peace, safety, and completion, which is what shalom means.
My version says hostility.
Hostility, right. All right, Romans 5, verse 1. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So if you're not a Christian, what do you have with God? Hostility. Not that hard word. Enmity. Right. If you're not a faithful follower of Jesus, you have enmity with God. But if you are justified by faith, you have peace with God. Right? The idea of shalom. Does that have anything to do with whether or not you have a lot of money in your bank account? No. Right? No. All right. Let's move on. Philippians chapter 3, verse 1. Somebody get that for me, please.
Furthermore, brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you.
All right, safeguard. The word shalom literally means peace. It means safety. So what is Paul telling the Philippians in Philippians 3:1? It's not a big deal for me to write the same thing to you again that I told you when I was there, right? So Paul reused his sermons. Anyways, it's not a big deal for me to tell you twice what I've already told you because it's safety for you, right? It's safety for you. It brings you safety. It brings you to where you're not an enemy of God. It brings you the Hebrew word shalom. Again, Old Testament is shalom. New Testament is not in Hebrew, but it's the same concept as this Hebrew word shalom. All right, James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, please.
My brother, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptation, knowing this, that the trying of your faith works patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, sometimes which will lack, wanting nothing.
All right. So that you may be perfect and complete or entire, right? Okay, so let's think this out here. What diverse temptations or various trials do people usually go through? What are some trials to people's faith? We talked about it Sunday, so hopefully you remember the sermon. What are some trials to people's faith? Tragedy. Look at that. He remembers the second part of the sermon. At least something stuck. Tragedy, loss of job, loss of a loved one, loss of something else, lack of funds, some sort of hardship, right? That's what James is telling them. When you face these physical trials, you need to pay attention because what it's doing is it's producing in you steadfastness. It's giving you the ability to be perfect and complete because you can see that Christianity isn't just about having rainbows and sunshine and having lots of stuff and having money and so forth. And so in doing that, it makes you complete. The word shalom also means complete. So the word that Jeremiah uses in Jeremiah 29:11 literally means the opposite, because when you go to the New Testament and you see how does a person become complete, it says you go through various trials, you don't prosper, and by not prospering, you learn steadfastness, and by having steadfastness, you become complete. So Jeremiah 29:11 cannot be talking about your physical things and God's going to give you all these things. Next week, we're going to look at John chapter 14, I believe. Hang on, I forgot my verse here. I believe it's John 14. Well, my verses are all mixed up. Yeah, John 14, verse 13 and 14, where it says, Jesus says, if you ask anything in my name, I'll give it to you. Okay? Anything? Okay. Jeremiah 20, the reason why I wanted to put this one right before John 14 is because Jeremiah 29:11 is saying, if you remain faithful, he's going to finish his promises, right? And his promises have very little to do with your physical desires. God, you can go to heaven with a Ferrari or without a Ferrari. Doesn't matter. Be a lot more fun if you went with one. Let me rephrase my sentence. You can go to heaven having had a Ferrari or not having had a Ferrari. It will be a lot more fun if you have had a Ferrari, though. I will say that. It doesn't, but you know, some caskets now have a drawer you can put stuff in. So, just saying. No. But yeah, your faithfulness does not rely on, or your physical prosperity does not rely on your faithfulness necessarily. Are there some concepts there? Yes. Right? If you're following the New Testament, you're going to understand what it means to be a servant. And so you're going to, and a hard worker and so forth. And so sometimes, barring any other extending circumstances, sometimes people who are faithful get nicer stuff, but not every time. The most faithful person I ever met was Miss Betty, who lived in Wilson, Arkansas. She didn't live in Wilson. She lived in Joyner, which is about 15 minutes away. She was the most destitute person I've ever met in my life, but she was also the most faithful. And she had this giant Bible with the words were like this big. I mean, it was massive. The Bible was like this thick and this big, and the words were huge. And I would mention something in class, and she would sit over there and she'd be flipping, and I knew she was finding the verse for me. And by the end of class, she'd go, it's da 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 da. She didn't look it up at all. She just knew, okay, that has to do with this, 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 this. And she just sat and studied her Bible all day. Most faithful person I've ever met. Could not even afford food. Right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have nice things just because God said that he had plans for the Jewish people to prosper. Right? All right, let's go ahead and take a break. The kids are back there waiting on us, and I have an exercise, if you want to call it that I want us to do when we get started back.